Welcome back to my channel. I debated quite a bit as to how to structure the next few videos, including this one. And I have finally concluded that I need to break the material up a little bit and do the introduction today, and then next week give some quotations from D.A. Carson to show that in fact his work is not associated with the view of John held by Dr. Michael Licona. And I can show that from quotations from Carson's published work. But I decided to do an introduction today first. So I try to keep the material on this YouTube channel kind of fresh, maybe something you're not going to just see in my other published work, but at the same time, sometimes there's a need to repeat what I've said in my published work. As many of you will know, Dr. Licona has come out with a new book lately called Jesus Contradicted, which is a popular, somewhat more popular level version of his literary device views that he first brought out in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels in 2017. And I'm going to be focusing over the next couple of weeks on the Gospel of John. In many ways, it was learning about the views of Dr. Licona on John, and then also the views of Craig Evans on John. There was a video from 2012 that resurfaced in 2017 that showed me just how far these gentlemen were going in their dehistoricizing, and I'm not ashamed to call it that, of the Gospel of John. First, I wrote The Mirror, the Mask, and then I wrote The Eye of the Beholder to argue that that view of John as historically dubious, if you're concerned about literal history, is wrong. And now, as my work is already out there, and then Dr. Licona is coming out with this new book, there's some sort of dialogue and questioning that's going back and forth where people are asking him about his views of the Gospel of John. There have been 2 interviews lately he's done, one with Tim Stratton, one with Eric Chabot, that say a lot of the same things. And I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on a quotation that I'll be reading today from the interview with Eric Chabot. But I'll be throwing in a couple of things from the interview with Tim Stratton also. And what I want to show is what's going on here rhetorically, because there are some really unfortunate things that are going on rhetorically in what Dr. Licona is saying. And then that sets me up to talk about D.A. Carson, who is one of the people whose work he invokes as if it's saying the same thing that he is saying. It's sort of iconic conservative scholar. Before I read the quotation from that recent interview, I'm going to just review quickly some of the views, and these are only some actually, of things that Dr. Licona has said about the Gospel of John. Some of them also come from Craig Evans, but these are places where Evans and Licona are to a large extent in agreement. So I want this to be clear in your mind, because he's going to be talking about, this stuff, these things, these kinds of generalizations with reference to the portions of his own scholarship on John that are, shall we say, controversial, and giving the impression of widespread conservative agreement with him on this stuff, these things. Now, he doesn't list all of these that I'm listing here, but that's kind of the point, that he's giving a broad impression of very broad agreement on his most controversial work, and it's helpful to get clear in mind just how controversial it is. So let me list some of these. One of them that actually does come up in the interview with Eric Chabot is that John invented the saying, "I thirst." Invented it. Now, in other words, that Jesus did not recognizably on the cross say, please give me some water, water, I'm thirsty, anything like that was recognizable in that place. And remember that John actually portrays someone as going and getting something and offering it to Jesus. So he makes it clear that in his story, he's portraying Jesus as saying something that the people around him recognize as an expression of physical thirst. Dr. Licona's view, which he shares with Daniel Wallace, actually, I don't know of anybody else that holds this particular view, is that John invented this and sort of in his mind was thinking of the historical saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? But of course, that, on the face of it, linguistically means something completely different. And then John's even showing people as bringing Jesus something. So just complete change, complete invention. Similar with It Is Finished, which was Johannine, allegedly, the theory, invention in place of Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. All right, so that's one set of very controversial views. Okay, wait for it to stop being fuzzy. All right, another thing that he has said repeatedly, including in his most recent book, it is impossible to know how far John went in adapting Jesus' teachings. Now, when I give you those Carson quotes next time, you'll see that Dr. Carson does not believe that it is impossible to know how far Jesus went. In his interview with Tim Stratton, he said that Jesus may have theologized history somewhat in appearing to record Jesus' discourses. He has argued, again, including in the more recent book, that there's reason to doubt that Jesus recognizably said, before Abraham was, I am. So, I mean, we're not talking about something a little expanded, like, before Abraham walked around in Canaan, I am, for I am one with the Father. Something a little longer that might have been shortened, but that he recognizably said that before the existence of Abraham, and then declared himself to be I am. And Dr. Licona's argument for questioning the recognizable historicity of this is that Jesus avoided making explicit claims for his own messiahship, so he wouldn't have said something that sounded that explicit about his own deity. And notice, too, that saying's really embedded into a dialogue. But, of course, supposedly one of these compositional devices was inventing dialogue anyway. So eventually this questioning of before Abraham was, I am, is going to cast out upon an entire scene. But then he says it doesn't matter anyway because there's high Christology in the synoptics. But the high Christology in the synoptics is in completely different settings. It's completely different incidents. So we're questioning the uniquely Johannine incident. He's definitely said that either John and Luke, on the one hand, or Matthew and Mark, on the other hand, relocated the first appearance of Jesus to his disciples, either from Galilee to Jerusalem, that would be John and Luke, or vice versa, from Jerusalem to Galilee. That would be, in his view, Matthew and Mark, although Mark doesn't actually narrate a appearance anyway. So, all right, notice that this would wreak havoc with John's entire sequence of Jesus' first two appearances and the circumstances surrounding them, because they're located very firmly in Jerusalem, and that's actually important. It's important to the fact that it occurs that very night, that they're in fear, that Thomas isn't with them, and then, later, and in Why Are the Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Licona agreed that the Doubting Thomas episode definitely appears to have taken place in Jerusalem. I agree with him there. So in John, they're staying in Jerusalem for at least a week. So if it really happened, if the first time he appeared to the male disciples really happened in Galilee, that's a big change. And that John invented breathing and saying, receive the Holy Spirit. So this is an entire sub-incident, which he says in Why Are There Differences, was to weave mention of Pentecost. And yeah, that view's been around for a while, but it wasn't considered a particularly conservative view. And if we're going to say that everything that John reports historically actually happened historically, then to say that this was made up is definitely not saying that John is giving us what I believe the phrase now is essentially faithful representation. So he's making up a whole sub-incident that's not an essentially faithful representation. So that's just to give you an idea of what this stuff and these views are. So now I'm going to go to the interview with Eric Chabot, and the question comes up in the interview. I'll link it in the show notes, of some criticisms that Dr. Licona's views have faced, and then specifically concerning the reporting of Jesus' words in the Gospel of John. So I want to read what Dr. Licona says. You've got Johannine specialists who have spent decades studying John's Gospel. They will all say that John has adapted Jesus' words using his own words, his own idioms here. So you'll have Paul Anderson. He'll say, well, did Jesus claim to all the I am statements? Did he say these in John? He says, I don't know, but he made claims very much like these. All of the I am statements in John, he, that's Jesus, makes claims similar in the synoptic gospels. So, for example, John, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Did Jesus utter those words? Don't know. But he said something very similar in Matthew and Luke, where he says, I think it's Matthew 11:27, no one knows the Father except the Son, and to whomever the Son chooses to reveal him. So it's the same message there, but different words. Now, I want to insert a comment here. Those are in completely different locations. Those are completely different circumstances. So if you thought that, oh, this is a minor little thing, no, because I am the way, the truth, and the life is said specifically in response to a little dialogue with the disciples on the night of Jesus' betrayal. And the Matthew 11, which is sometimes called a Johannine thunderbolt, is in a completely different setting. Okay, back to Dr. Licona's words. So I think they sometimes just want to take some of these things that I'm saying about John because it's new to them, and just take this to extremes when I'm not saying extremes. Or maybe they even think what I've just said is an extreme. And therefore, you can't trust John. Well, I've got news for them, and that is that this is not new at all. This is stuff that evangelical New Testament scholars have been saying for a very long time. People like D.A. Carson and Craig Blomberg and Grant Osborne and Leon Morris and Craig Keener and Paul Anderson and F.F. Bruce, they've been saying these things for a long time. It's just the folks that are struggling with this, they aren't reading this academic literature. They're not reading the commentaries, the academic commentaries on this stuff. And so it's new to them, and they're finding it difficult to accept. Now, if you can't hear the condescension there, I submit that you're tone deaf. The condescension there is thick enough to cut with a knife. And then later, Eric sort of raises some concerns. He's like, yeah, I see where it's kind of a concern because we're using before Abraham was, I am, and these things in talking with Muslims and so forth. And then Dr. Licona says, it's a puzzle. I don't think anyone really knows the answer. And then he says that we shouldn't put a rigid report view on John, and he compares it to someone who thought that all of the characters in Jesus' parables were historical characters. How's that for a straw man? I mean, to say that Jesus recognizably in the incident as described in John said before Abraham was, I am, is not to be so rigid and literal that you don't know how to recognize a parable. Wow. Okay. So, now remember, I've just reminded you of what, these controversial views really are. Now, I want to go through some implications, some rhetorical implications here. And I want to point them out, and I want to reply to them. So first of all, if you disagree with Dr. Licona's views on John, the strong implication here is you are alone. In fact, all of these scholars agree sufficiently with Dr. Licona that if you disagreed with him and his view of the Gospel of John and this puzzle and how hard it is to tell and it's impossible to tell how far John went, etc., you'd have to be disagreeing with all of them, all of these other people that you previously respected. In the interview with Tim Stratton, he refers to these as bulwark conservatives. In the interview with Tim Stratton, he says these are people who have spent decades and they all agree on this stuff. What stuff? Okay, so maybe then he would say, well, no, not every single thing. Okay, how much? Okay, because they're discussing in the context here people who've challenged and criticized his views. And the things I just listed here, the eye thirst and John inventing the breathing and it's impossible to know how far and John theologized history and et cetera, that's this stuff that I'm criticizing. And so I'm going to say it's not the case that everybody that he lists here agrees sufficiently, at least, with what is considered controversial in his views, that you'd have to go up against all of them at the same time. It's not true, but that's the implication. All right, now also this smacks of an argument from authority. Even if it were true, that doesn't automatically mean that they're right. So I feel that there's a kind of academic browbeating going on here, like, well, you wouldn't want to go up against so many other people here, these people you used to respect, you better just go along with it. And again, that's pretty classic informal fallacy of an argument from authority. You just have to accept it. And phrases like they're finding it difficult to accept, they're struggling, etc. All right, third implication. If you're shocked by this, or if you don't accept it, which is designated patronizingly as struggling or finding it difficult, it's because you're ignorant and unqualified, and that's why you should defer to the experts. What's interesting here is this statement, it's new, and people who criticize his views don't know this because they're not reading the academic literature. I've been reading the academic literature for years. Quite a few years, yes, including academic commentaries. And so it's not like there's some argument out there, and that's the other implication, is that, well, there are just these arguments that you, laymen, are too ignorant to understand, which has sort of forced these conservatives to this conclusion. At one point, Chabot says to him, well, do they say this because John's just so different? Is that why? And they, in the context, appears to me, this big honor roll he's given of all of these conservative scholars. Why do they say it? So, it never seems to occur to Chabot that Dr. Licona is exaggerating the degree of agreement here. And he's reaching to try to say, well, what exactly is the argument? Okay, well, that's why I wrote The Eye of the Beholder. I know what the argument is. I know it in quite some detail. I have 3 chapters in The Eye of the Beholder on Johannine idiom, which is the argument that Dr. Licona gives here. So it's not true that if you find these views highly controversial, if you resist them, if you don't agree with them, it's just because you're ignorant. And that your ignorance just means that all the more so you should defer to the experts because, you've been out of touch. So I've got news for you. And this is not new. They've been saying it for a very long time, he says. Now, there's something else that I want to bring out here that makes this implication about, if you didn't know this, that's just another sign that, you're unqualified. So if this is new to someone who's listening to my video here, and that is this. There's another reason why you may not have heard of this. I can document this. There is a big taboo, and has been for years, on informing laymen of views held by evangelical labeled scholars that are going to disturb or distress the layman, especially informing the layman of it in such a way that you criticize it. Maybe you're allowed to do it. In fact, sometimes Dr. Licona does do it, like in his 2017 book and again in the new book, but all surrounded by, but this is all fine. This is no problem. This is no big deal. You just have to accept it, etc. So maybe you're allowed to do that if you agree with it, but to be out there and informing people, like, did you know that Craig Evans said that if you followed Jesus around with a video camera, you wouldn't find him saying all of these things, and that those are from the Johannine community? I have quotations, big quotations, from Craig Evans saying that the I am sayings are actually the statements of the Johannine community about what Jesus is for us. And when I tried to draw attention to this in 2017 and 2018, I just ran into a brick wall. I mean, there were calls for silencing me, all kinds of things. You're not supposed to tell people about this if you're going to criticize it, only if you're going to say, but it's fine, peace, peace. So maybe the reason you haven't heard these things until now is because of this taboo on any sort of critical notice being taken of them. And that's pretty serious. I can give another example. I can give multiple examples. My book, Testimonies to the Truth, that just came out a couple years ago here, it is almost entirely positive. The emphasis is very strongly on the positive evidence for the Gospels. I have footnotes. I just double-checked this using a search function before I made this video. The only negative references that I make to any evangelical scholars are in footnotes, okay? Footnotes or endnotes, but, notes, okay? They're mildly worded. They're few and far between. They do not dominate the book at all. Yet nonetheless, there was a potential endorser of the book, I'm not going to name him, to whom my publisher sent the book to ask him for an endorsement at my suggestion. I thought he would endorse it. He wrote back to my publisher and he called the book excellent. He said it was excellent. But he explicitly said that he would not be comfortable endorsing it as long as it contained negative statements about Doctors Licona, Daniel Wallace, and Craig Evans, because they had done a lot for apologetics and et cetera, okay? And I don't know if he already knew the things I was reporting there, but his entire focus was this was something negative. And it was, again, very mildly worded, things like, unfortunately, some evangelicals hold this, or just stating that Dr. Licona and Dr. Wallace think that John invented I thirst and it is finished as a adaptation of these other sayings. Very different on the face of it. So it was just the fact that it was negative. So this is not a figment of my imagination. So if you have not heard before about these controversial views, that's not a reason for you to trust the experts more. If anything, that's a reason for you to kind of look into these things yourself and find out more about them yourself, because part of the reason you don't know is because things are being kept from people who might react negatively to them unless they're padded all around with positive statements. And it's disturbing. And so this whole, this is new. Well, I've got news for you. Well, now he has news because now he's going to say, so, toe the line. But otherwise, it was, oh, we shouldn't criticize our fellow believers and so forth. So, yeah, that's a problem. It makes it distasteful. And this particular type of patronization is particularly distasteful in that context. Okay, another implication here, and also in the comments to Tim Stratton, is that the definition of a conservative scholar or an evangelical scholar is a kind of indelible mark. And if you've previously thought of a scholar as conservative, you can't change your mind about that. You can't reclassify that scholar because he holds to some view that you would have thought of as paradigmatically non-conservative. So it's not that the views are what makes somebody conservative or non-conservative. It's just, I don't know, whatever you thought of him as before. And that's highly questionable. I mean, this would be subject to a reductio. If it were indeed true that every person on this list held these things that I listed for you before, like this kind of very significant doubt about Jesus recognizably saying, before Abraham was I am, and inventing I thirst, and saying, it's just a puzzle, it's impossible to know how far John went in adapting, then I'd be like, well, rats, shoot. I previously thought of that as a conservative scholar. Now I don't think of him as a conservative scholar again. That's what happened, and I think should have happened, with Craig Evans. When these very lengthy comments about John and that this is the production of the Johannine community and so forth came out, I was like, oh, okay. I guess Craig Evans isn't as conservative as I thought he was. If labels like conservative, moderate, liberal are to have any utility in communicating among ourselves, surely they should be tied to the views rather than being an indelible mark on a person, and then whatever new view that person comes up with, we're going to redefine and say, okay, I guess that's a conservative view. Why would we do it that way? And then finally, implication is that comments on style that a scholar might make translate over to these other views, because in several of these cases, Dr. Licona is finding comments about style, and it's particularly noticeable in the case of D.A. Carson, to some extent Craig Blomberg and F.F. Bruce as well, where he'll find comments about Johannine style, Johannine idiom, and we'll just translate that over to, this stuff, these things. If you think his views are problematic, well, he's got news for you that these conservative scholars, bulwark conservatives, as he calls them in one place, have known these things for a long time. But comments on style don't per se translate to this widespread doubt about how far John has theologized history. And I think we can see that especially clearly in the work of D.A. Carson. And so that's what I'm going to do next time. And you can see why I split them, because this one already has been a full video length. But next time I'm going to take the little quotation from Carson that Dr. Licona uses, and then I'm going to give you a bunch of others that show why you can't translate a comment about Johannine idiom into Dr. Licona's and Dr. Evans's views of the Gospel of John. So this has been a particularly rampaging kind of YouTube video, and I'm sure that all the usual people will say, wow, how nasty and how mean and how crazy Lydia is and her bad tone and everything, but I think there's grounds for concern here, and I really deplore this tone in that quotation I read to you about, I've got news for you, and they've known this for a long time, and these people are just struggling, and they just don't know, and all that. That's a very problematic tone as well. Instead, what I want to do is empower people to look at these things for themselves. And, maybe you'll look at it for yourself, and you'll be like, yeah, no, I think John is still questionably historical. Hey, read The Eye of the Beholder if you've got that question, but don't just fall into it because someone is engaging in a kind of academic browbeating that's a tone that we should eschew as well, and we should aim for at least clarity. So please come back next time, and we'll talk about D.A. Carson and the Gospel of John here on the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.